All my troubles seem so far away. Remember to let her into your heart. Let it be, let it be, let it be.
Today we're diving into the whole story of how four working-class lads from Liverpool became the most influential band in human history, but the journey wasn't as smooth as you might think. We're talking about deportations from Germany, record label rejections, cultural revolutions, and a breakup so messy it shocked the world. But here's the thing. Their story goes way deeper than just the music. These four guys literally changed how we think about fame, creativity, and what it means to be young. And if you stick around until the end, I'll reveal the shocking way they're still making music together in 2024. Yes, you heard that right. So, without further ado, let's jump into the Beatles, the whole story. January 30th, 1969. London, 3 Savile Row. Picture this. It's a cold Thursday afternoon, and suddenly the streets of central London are filled with the sound of rock and roll echoing off the buildings. Office workers are hanging out of windows, crowds are gathering on rooftops, and the police are getting phone calls about a disturbance. But this isn't just any band causing chaos, this is the Beatles, performing live for the first time in over 2 years on the roof of their own building. John Lennon is bundled up in a fur coat, Paul McCartney is wearing a black suit, George Harrison looks like he'd rather be anywhere else, and Ringo Starr is just trying to keep the beat while the wind threatens to blow his drums off the roof.
Move over once, move over twice. Come on, baby, don't be cold as ice.
For 42 minutes, they played songs that no one had ever heard before. The police eventually shut them down, and as they packed up their instruments, John Lennon walked to the microphone and said something that would prove to be prophetic. I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we pass the audition.
Thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves. I hope we pass the audition.
But here's what makes this moment so incredible and so tragic. This wasn't just any performance. This was the Beatles' final public concert, ever. The four friends who had conquered the world were about to fall apart completely. But how did it get to this point? How did the biggest band in history end up playing their last show on a rooftop because they couldn't even agree on where else to perform? To understand that, we need to go back to where it all started going wrong. Let's rewind to August 27, 1967. The Beatles had just released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, arguably the greatest album ever made. They were at the absolute peak of their creative and commercial power. And then, in one phone call, everything changed. Brian Epstein, their manager, the man who had discovered them at the Cavern Club and guided them from leather jackets to worldwide superstardom, was found dead in his London home, drug overdose. He was only 32 years old. But here's what you need to understand about Brian's death. It wasn't just losing a manager. Brian was the fifth Beatle, the guy who made all the business decisions so the band could focus on music. Without him, they were four incredibly talented musicians with no idea how to handle the business side of being the Beatles. Paul McCartney tried to step up and take control. His first project? Magical Mystery Tour, a psychedelic bus journey that was supposed to be their next film. It was a disaster. Critics called it blatant rubbish and a witless home movie. For the first time in their career, the Beatles had created something that people actually hated. But there was something else tearing the band apart from the inside: drugs. Not just any drugs, but LSD. And the story of how they first tried it is absolutely wild. April 1965, John Lennon, George Harrison, and their wives were having a nice dinner with their dentist. Just a normal evening, right? Wrong. The dentist slipped LSD into their coffee without telling them. They had no idea what was happening to them. John later described it as a very concentrated version of the best feeling I'd ever had in my life. But LSD didn't just make them feel good. It completely changed how they thought about music, about life, about everything. This is where things get really interesting, because LSD split the band in two ways. First, it opened their minds to incredible creative possibilities. Sgt. Pepper's wouldn't exist without those acid trips. But second, it made them question everything, including whether they wanted to be Beatles anymore. November 9th, 1966. John Lennon walked into the Indica Art Gallery in London for an exhibition by a Japanese artist named Yoko Ono. There was one piece that caught his attention, a ladder leading up to a canvas on the ceiling. You had to climb the ladder and use a magnifying glass to read what was written on the canvas. Most artists would have written something negative, something cynical, but Yoko's canvas just said, "Yes." John was intrigued. This woman wasn't a Beatles fan. She'd barely even heard of them. She was an avant-garde artist, an intellectual, someone who challenged him in ways he'd never experienced. They started an affair that would eventually destroy John's marriage, and many people believe the Beatles themselves. But here's the thing everyone gets wrong about Yoko. She didn't break up the Beatles. The Beatles were already breaking up. Yoko just made it impossible to pretend everything was fine. 1968. The Beatles were supposed to be recording their follow-up to Sgt. Pepper's. Instead, they were barely speaking to each other. John brought Yoko to every recording session, breaking their sacred rule of no wives in the studio.
Something in the way she moves.
Paul was trying to control every aspect of the music. George was frustrated that his songs were being ignored. And Ringo actually quit the band, August 22nd, 1968. Ringo Starr walked out of Abbey Road Studios and didn't come back for 2 weeks. He went to Peter Sellers' yacht in the Mediterranean and seriously considered never returning. The other three had to beg him to come back. The album they eventually released, the White Album, was brilliant, but you can hear the tension in every song. It's the sound of four friends who used to finish each other's sentences now barely able to be in the same room together. But wait, I'm getting ahead of myself, because to understand how four best friends became four strangers, we need to go back to when they were still conquering the world. Let's go back to 1966. The Beatles were the biggest band in the world, but they had a problem that seems impossible to imagine today. They were too successful. Picture this. Shea Stadium, New York, August 15th, 1965. 55,600 screaming fans. The Beatles walk out on stage and the noise is so loud it's like standing next to a jet engine. They can't hear themselves play. They can't hear each other sing. Ringo Starr later said he just had to watch John and Paul's backs to know when to hit the drums because he couldn't hear anything else. They were performing, but nobody, including them, could hear the music. They had become a visual experience, not a musical one. And it was getting dangerous. In the Philippines, July 1966, they declined an invitation to have breakfast with the First Lady. The government turned the entire country against them. They were attacked at the airport, had to give back their concert money, and barely escaped with their lives. But the real breaking point came from something John Lennon said in an interview with a London journalist in March 1966. He said, "We're more popular than Jesus now."
As Beatles, as though those other Beatles, like other people say, I just said they are having more influence on kids and things than anything else, including Jesus.
In Britain, nobody cared. But when that quote was reprinted in an American teen magazine, all hell broke loose. Record burnings in the Bible Belt, death threats, Ku Klux Klan protests, radio stations banning their music. Here's what's crazy about this controversy. John wasn't bragging. He was actually making a point about how sad it was that teenagers cared more about a rock band than about religion. But context doesn't matter when you're dealing with mass hysteria.
But I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is. You know, I just said what I said and it was wrong.
August 29th, 1966, Candlestick Park, San Francisco. The Beatles played their final paid concert ever. They were done with touring, done with the screaming, done with not being able to hear their own music. But here's the ironic thing. Giving up touring was the best decision they ever made for their music because now they could spend months in the studio, creating sounds that could never be performed live. 1966 to 1967, Abbey Road Studios became the Beatles' playground. They were spending 700 hours recording a single album. They were using the studio as an instrument, not just a place to capture their performance. Tomorrow Never Knows took 55 hours to record just one song. They were using tape loops, backwards recordings, Indian instruments, orchestras. Paul McCartney was bringing in experimental techniques he'd learned at avant-garde concerts in London. The result was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album that didn't just change music, it changed what people thought music could be. May 26, 1967. Peppers was released and immediately went to #1 in both the UK and US. It stayed there for months. It was the first album to print the lyrics, the first true concept album, and it influenced everyone from the Beach Boys to Pink Floyd. June 25, 1967. The Beatles were chosen to represent Britain in the first ever live global television broadcast. 500 million people in 25 countries watched them perform All You Need Is Love, live from Abbey Road Studios.
All you need is love.
Think about that for a second. 500 million people, all watching four guys from Liverpool sing about love and peace. They weren't just musicians anymore, they were cultural leaders, the voice of a generation that was questioning everything their parents had taught them. But with great power comes great pressure, and the pressure of being the Beatles, of having to save the world through music, was starting to crush them. February 1968. The Beatles traveled to India to study transcendental meditation with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. They were searching for something, peace, meaning, a way to handle the insanity of their lives. For a few weeks it worked. They wrote some of their best songs in India, Dear Prudence, Blackbird, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. But even in the middle of nowhere, they couldn't escape the tensions that were tearing them apart. Ringo left after 10 days. He couldn't handle the food. Paul left after a few weeks. He had business to attend to. John and George stayed the longest, but even they eventually left amid rumors and suspicions about the Maharishi's motives. They had gone to India to find themselves, but all they found was that they were four very different people who wanted very different things from life. But how did four different people become the Beatles in the first place? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning. Let's rewind to February 7th, 1964. John F. Kennedy Airport, New York City. The Beatles' plane touches down, and they look out the window to see 3,000 screaming teenagers waiting for them. They literally couldn't believe it. 2 days later, February 9th, 1964, The Ed Sullivan Show. 73 million Americans watched the Beatles that night. That's 45% of the entire television audience. Crime rates actually dropped during the broadcast because everyone was watching TV.
Won't you please help?
But here's what's incredible about their American breakthrough. It almost didn't happen. Capitol Records, which was owned by the same company as their British label, had rejected them multiple times. They said American teenagers would never go for British rock and roll. It was only when I Want to Hold Your Hand started getting radio play from imported copies that Capitol finally paid attention. By April 1964, the Beatles occupied the first 5 positions on the Billboard Hot 100 simultaneously. Nobody had ever done that before. Nobody's done it since. The Beatles didn't just conquer America. They opened the floodgates for every British band that followed. The Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Who, the Zombies. None of them would have had American careers without the Beatles proving that British rock could work. But success in America was just the culmination of something that had been building in Britain for over a year. 1963 was the year everything changed. Please Please Me hit number 1 in January. From Me to You hit number 1 in April. She Loves You hit number 1 in August and became the fastest-selling single in British history.
She says she loves you, and you know that can't be bad.
By the end of 1963, the Beatles were selling 1 million records a week. Nobody had ever done that before, not even Elvis Presley. October 13th, 1963. Val Parnell's Sunday Night at the London Palladium. 18 million people watched the Beatles on television that night. The next day, the newspapers had a new word: Beatlemania. November 4th, 1963. The Royal Variety Performance. The Beatles were performing for Princess Margaret and the Queen Mother, the absolute pinnacle of the British establishment. John Lennon, never one to miss an opportunity for mischief, looked out at the distinguished audience and said, "For the people in the cheaper seats, clap your hands. And the rest of you, if you'll just rattle your jewelry."
For the people in the cheaper seats, clap your hands. And the rest of you, if you just rattle your jewelry.
It was cheeky, it was subversive, but it was delivered with such charm that even the royals laughed. The working-class rebels had officially infiltrated the establishment. But how did 4 working-class kids from Liverpool get to this point? The answer lies in a series of lucky breaks, near disasters, and one man who saw their potential when nobody else would. 1962. Brian Epstein, their manager, was taking the Beatles demo tape to every record label in London. Columbia said no. HMV said no. Philips said no. Pi said no. Oriole said no. Then came the famous Decca audition on New Year's Day, 1962. They drove through the night, got lost, arrived exhausted. They played 15 songs, giving everything they had.
The tears keep on falling all night long.
Decca's response: "Guitar groups are on the way out. The Beatles have no future in show business." Imagine being that spectacularly wrong about something. Finally, George Martin at EMI's Parlophone label heard their demo. He wasn't blown away by their music, but he was intrigued by their personalities. He gave them a chance. But before they could become recording artists, they had to become a real band. And that happened in the most unlikely place, the red light district of Hamburg, Germany. August 1960. The Beatles, John, Paul, George, Stuart Sutcliffe, and Pete Best, arrived in Hamburg to play at the Kaiserkeller Club. They were kids. The youngest was only 17, and they were about to get the education of their lives. They lived in a storage room behind a porn cinema. No windows, no heating, sharing the space like animals, but they had to play 6, 7, sometimes 12 hours a night. The club owner would shout, "Mach schau, make a show." This is where the Beatles learned to be performers, not just musicians. They learned to entertain, to create an experience, to make people feel something. The waiters gave them preludin, basically speed, to keep them going through those marathon sets. John would dance like a gorilla. They'd knock their heads together, anything to keep the crowd engaged. But Hamburg was also where they faced their first major crisis. November 1960. Just when things were going well in Hamburg, everything fell apart. George Harrison was only 17, and German authorities discovered he was working underage. He was deported immediately. A few days later, Paul McCartney and Stuart Sutcliffe went back to their old accommodation to collect their belongings. The place was in total darkness because the club owner had cut the power out of spite. They lit a condom on fire and nailed it to the wall for light, causing minor damage to the wall. The club owner reported them for arson, and they were arrested and deported too. John followed shortly after, leaving only Stuart behind with his new girlfriend, Astrid. And that brings us full circle, back to that rooftop concert on January 30th, 1969. You see, the Beatles' story isn't just about four guys who got famous. It's about how four working-class kids from a bombed-out city refused to accept the limitations the world put on them. They got deported from Germany, rejected by every major record label, criticized by the establishment, and attacked by governments. But they never gave up. From that freezing rooftop in 1969, playing to office workers hanging out of windows, back to those early days in Liverpool when they'd travel across the entire city just to learn a new chord, the Beatles proved that with enough talent, determination, and friendship, you can literally change the world. But here's what's really incredible about their legacy: it's still growing. Even after John was murdered in 1980, even after George died in 2001, even after all the lawsuits and bitter feelings, the music lives on. And now, here's that reward I promised for sticking around until the end. In November 2023, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr did something that seemed impossible. Using artificial intelligence technology, they took a demo tape that John Lennon had recorded in his apartment in 1978, just him and a piano, and they completed it as the Beatles. The song is called Now and Then, and it's officially the last Beatles song. Using AI, they were able to isolate John's voice from the original demo, clean it up, and add new instrumentation from Paul and Ringo, plus guitar parts that George had recorded during the 1990s anthology sessions.
Now and then, I miss you.
So, in 2024, the Beatles are still making music together. John Lennon, who died 44 years ago, is singing lead vocals on a brand new Beatles song. If that doesn't prove that some friendships and some music are truly timeless, I don't know what does. The Beatles showed us that four friends with a shared vision could change everything. How we think about music, about fame, about youth, about what's possible when you refuse to accept the word no. From the Cavern Club to the rooftop of Apple Corps, from Love Me Do to Now and Then, the Beatles' story never really ends. It just keeps inspiring new generations to pick up instruments, write songs, and maybe, just maybe, change the world. What do you think about their incredible journey? Which part of the Beatles' story surprised you the most? Drop a comment and let me know. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the greatest band of all time, smash that like button, subscribe for more music documentaries, and I'll see you in the next one. As always, thanks for watching, and remember, all you need is love.